poured his heart out to a pretty blonde waitress named Peggy Morton and found a kindred soul. On the 2nd of August 1978, they were married. Peggy gave birth to a son, Ben. A daughter, Amber Jean, soon followed. The darkness was beginning to lift. A new generation was making itself heard, its voice loud, rebellious and nasty. Punk. Neil Young, the quintessential rock rebel, voiced his approval, while punk deity Johnny Rotten proclaimed Young a kindred spirit.
To Neil Young, punk rock was balls out great. I mean, he looked at those guys as all energy, all raw, let's cut it now, let's keep it now, first take, best take. And that's how Neil himself approached a lot of his recordings. And when he saw these guys, angry guys coming up, playing that music, he said, this is for me.
Punk's chaotic energy revitalized Neil's music. Reaching out to robotic rockers Devo, Young found them surprisingly receptive.
It was a completely surreal interaction. There was a great intersection where we overlapped. We found out that he had a really twisted sense of humor, and he was a really smart guy. He just articulated it in a different way. We were doing a song, I think we were doing Praying Hands. Neil jumps on stage, and then he plays with us, and then he jumps into the crowd like the Punks always did. Except nobody caught him.
Neil infused his next album, Rust Never Sleeps, with punk's vibrant energy. It was his most successful work since Harvest. Rolling Stone named it Best Album of the Year, and Neil Young, the year's top artist. At 32, an age when most rock musicians had fallen by the wayside, Neil Young was on a roll. But once again, tragedy was about to strike. In the late 1970s, Neil Young made an improbable climb back to the top of the charts. But in 1979, his son Ben was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Music had always been the center of Neil Young's life. Now he had to put it aside to care for his son, searching out every form of help available. It would be 4 years before Neil Young began touring again. But by then, America's political and musical tastes had radically shifted.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the
Ronald Reagan was president, and British bands like Duran Duran and Flock of Seagulls dominated the charts. Rebellion was out of fashion, and so were the rock and roll rebels like Neil Young. Neil struggled to find his creative footing, experimenting with a mind-boggling array of genres and personas.
In the 1980s, Neil Young was like the Robert De Niro of rock and roll. He assumed a whole series of characters, from the whacked-out roots rocker, leader of the Shocking Pinks, to the twang guy dude in the barn with Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, to the blues man, shades on, all night, all day, every moment of the life of the Blue Notes.
He makes this record, God bless him. You know, he cuts off all of his hair, he puts on a new wave tie, he's singing through a vocoder, this little thing that makes your voice sound, you know, like a robot from Forbidden Planet or something.
By 1989, Neil Young's career had bottomed out. The final insult came when he was sued by music giant David Geffen, who claimed Young was making unsellable records on purpose, costing his label millions of dollars.
He really did, I think, disturb fans, critic, public, record companies. But the thing about Neil is, you know, Neil's going to do what Neil wants to do.
After leaving Geffen, Neil returned to Reprise Records, the label with whom he'd done his best work, and refound his musical roots. His next albums, Freedom and Ragged Glory, won him a whole new generation of musical fans, from Smashing Pumpkins to the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
A lot of people had written Neil off saying, this guy's lost it. But Freedom capped the decade in a way that propelled him into a series of records with Crazy Horse in the early 90s that brought him back onto center stage with a whole new audience across the spectrum, young kids, his old fans, and Neil was back.
Long hair, flannel shirts and ripped jeans. Grunge bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden dressed like Neil Young had done back in 1971. But the connections were more than cosmetic. Young's rebel stance and his unwillingness to compromise his art for commercial gain made him a role model for the new movement, and he was dubbed the Godfather of Grunge.
All these young upstarts admire Neil because, you know, he's not some anemic guy doing a beer commercial, and they admire that cantankerousness about him and that defiance.
A musical alliance with Pearl Jam resulted in 1995's Mirror Ball.
Here he is, evoking the true spirit of the 1960s with 90s sensibilities, backed up by grunge rockers from Seattle. Brilliant!
Here's this band, Pearl Jam, what, half his age, more than that? And he, not only does he record with them, but he really kind of takes the band over when he goes out on the road, minus Eddie Vedder, their lead singer, and really, they become his Crazy Horse.
Neil Young still drives himself as hard as ever, recording albums, touring and writing film soundtracks. But time and experience have left their mark.
I also see a lot of his father, especially as he's gotten older. There's been a sort of mellowness to Neil that I would associate maybe with his pa.
The self-absorbed artist has evolved into an outspoken advocate for humanitarian causes. He's a prime mover in Farm Aid, lending his prestige and musical skills to keep the American farm in the hands of the American farmer.
Shouldn't be having to do this anymore, but the government still hasn't woken up to what needs to be done to change the situation. There's nothing hip about this. This is real. This is for America's farmers.
Following the tragedy of 9/11, Neil took part in the telethon to benefit the victims' families, performing a number by one of his idols, John Lennon.
It's easy if you try. No hell below us.
And he continues to play brilliant, blistering rock and roll on albums and in concert. When Neil Young stood before the crowd to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he seemed genuinely surprised at the standing ovation he received. He's lived his life to his own standards, burning important bridges along the way. His challenging, deeply personal music has flown in the face of an industry obsessed with churning out a commercial product. And he's stuck to his artistic guns, often leaving his audiences dazed and confused.
Neil Young as an artist is fearless. He's not afraid to fail. He once said that he doesn't care if his audience is 100 people or 100 million people.
14-year-old kids who know Neil Young have a deep admiration and respect for him when he's been around playing music since 1963. And won new fans along the way is really quite astounding. He has never become a nostalgia act.
John Gotti once said, you may live to be 5,000 years, you ain't never going to meet a guy like me. You live 5,000 years, you're never going to meet a guy like Neil Young.
Through illness, conflict, and changing times, Neil Young has survived the only way he knows how, by staying true to himself.